Greetings, Tribal Jazzman Scholar. I want to talk about the human body and its natural healing mechanisms and the immune system. I want to touch on that as well. I remember reading a biology book 26 years ago. It was sitting on the table at my parents' home. I'm not sure what it was doing there. I think my cousin was in college taking a biology course and he left his book out. And I opened up and read a chapter on the immune system. And what struck me, what was so fantastic and complex and bewildering to me, was this idea that when an alien body or an invasive parasitic type virus or bacteria or the like is in the body, there's a specific cell that goes and sort of examines. I mean, this is what this immune system does. There's a cell that studies the way the invasive cell or virus looks and then goes back to another part of the body and communicates that shape and the features of it, and then the body produces a cell that, like a key fitting into a lock, will be able to mimic the surface area of that virus or that invasive bacterial cell, and then will create these immune cells that can go and surround it and sort of latch onto it. And I remember in my mind I was thinking, well, what do you mean the cell can identify? What does it have, eyes? Is it looking? Is it that little clipboard or the notebook? How does it see it? How does it identify and record the information? How does it then communicate it accurately enough that the other part of the body can produce a cell that will be like the key to the lock that will surround that virus and be able to remove it from the body? I mean, it's what I realized in reading that was that human immunology, the defense mechanisms within the body, can be described in general terms by doctors and by medicine and biology, but the actual way that these different features of the body work, what's really going on, is still a fantastic mystery. So it's a very mysterious thing, the human body. I became injured about 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. My arms became injured because I was practicing piano improperly. I had become a professional jazz pianist, and I was always building my technical ability by playing scales, and often I would warm up slowly, and then I got into this habit of warming up a little too fast. And over the course of maybe a couple of years of a lot of playing, I began to get pain in my arms, and the pain went from uncomfortable to very severe very quickly. And the recommendation of a number of friends who had been in this profession a long time was I had to stop playing immediately. I had to try to figure out what was wrong with me. One very dear friend just kept saying to me, I remember this conversation, no, you have to stop. And I said, well, you mean this week? No, you have to stop and figure out what's wrong. And he really meant that I had to give up the music until I could heal myself, or I was going to get so injured that the healing would take a lot longer. So I made it my project to figure out how to get well. And I began by, of course, visiting doctors, and the first few doctors I met put me on anti-inflammatory medications. I was sent to a number. My parents very, very generously helped to pay for a number of specialists, neurologists, orthopedic specialists, different types of doctors who could examine me in lots of different ways, and none of them really had much ability to help me. They said, oh yeah, your arms are sore, and here, try this medicine, and try this anti-inflammatory, and try these painkillers, and I wanted somebody to tell me what I needed to do to get well, not how to mask the symptoms. So I began to talk to musicians. I would call all the musicians I knew, and I'd say, do you know anybody who was injured? And I'd get more phone numbers. And I managed to speak to about a half dozen musicians who all had some ideas what to do. And I remember speaking to a drummer. I don't remember his name. I'd never met him, and he was referred by somebody else. And the drummer said to me something that was really, really powerful for me, and it had a lot to do with my eventual healing. He said, okay, let me tell you two things. First of all, doctors can't help you. Doctors aren't going to be able to help you. The second thing is, you've got to figure out your own path to healing. You've got to listen to all the different people who give you suggestions. You've got to try all the things that you try, and then you've got to assemble them in a way that works for you and that makes sense for you. And so I did that. I listened to lots of different musicians who had been injured and gotten well, and I picked from these different people, different ways of both addressing the acute pain, but then also moving towards sort of some kind of healing for myself as well. What I eventually discovered, and what eventually I believe led to my ultimate healing, was something called the Alexander technique. At first somebody talked to me about it, and it sounded a little preposterous, and I recorded it in my mind. And then another person I ran into, a woman who did landscaping and had really bad neck pain, said, "Oh yeah, Alexander technique really helped me." And I'm thinking, well, my neck doesn't hurt; it's my arms. And then I read about in Keyboard magazine an article called "Hands on Fire" about overuse syndrome. And once again, I saw the name Alexander technique, and so I sort of had a rule for myself. If I hear it enough times, I need to pay attention to it. So I'd heard Alexander technique enough times. I made contact with the local training institute in Los Angeles that actually trained Alexander teachers, a 3-year training program, very rigorous. And the director of the institute, a woman named Pamela Blanc, said, "I take private students." I ended up studying with her for almost 2 years. And I studied this technique called the Alexander technique, and I wanted to summarize that. And it's a wonderful human discovery, yet the creativity of the human mind and the way people have a vision and then embody it in their work. Matthias Alexander was an Australian actor who made his living orating in public Shakespeare's sonnets and monologues. So he lost his ability to orate. He would get tight in the throat, hoarse in the throat, and lose his ability to speak. And this would happen to him repeatedly, and he finally set up a group of mirrors. This is how the story goes. And he watched himself orating and identified what eventually led to his creation of the Alexander technique, which is still to this day used by a lot of people to address neck and back injuries. But it ended up being something that began by helping my neck and eventually helping a whiplash injury that I had for years. And then it began to help my spine and a lower back discomfort, and then my hip that I'd had as a congenital problem, and eventually all the way down to my arms. I was able to play piano again and play free of pain. But what the Alexander technique is premised upon is the idea that we are a fully upright vertebrate, and that we are the only one. And vertebrate animals lead their movement with their head. So a snake being the obvious example, is it moving, it's pulling itself in a way with its head, so that every time a vertebrate animal moves, there's a lengthening of the spine. Well, when humans became fully bipedal, we began to have gravity working against our spine. And so when we get up, for example, from a seated posture, we sort of thrust our torso into our head and we compress along our spine. That combined with innumerable stresses in the environment, which lead us to do what's called a contraction, which is this movement, head down, shoulders up. It's a protective thing. When you hear a door slam, you go like this. It's designed to protect the spine and the head by bringing it together like a turtle pulling into its shell. Because of the innumerable stresses that are innate to our environment, we tend to be in a compressed state a lot of the time. So bipedalism, where our body was working against gravity, and the stresses of being a Homo sapien have created a compression along the spine of most people. So what Alexander discovered was that the control of the organism, what he called the primary control of the organism, was located at this very simple point where the very top vertebrae, 2 little bones, rested into 2 little pockets in the cavities of the skull behind the brainstem. So these 2 little points on the vertebra rest in these 2 little pockets on the skull, and they're surrounded by very small muscles. And that's a key feature of this technique, because all the other muscles are layered upon them. There are layers and layers of muscles on the back. The smallest ones are the ones that connect each vertebra one to the other. And the only way to begin to release pressure along the spine is to learn to go to what Alexander called this primary control of the organism, which is where the top vertebra meets the skull. And so to go to that place, though, requires a complete cognitive reprogramming of our bodies. And I notice whenever I talk to people about the Alexander technique, they start trying to straighten their neck and back, and you can't do that. So basically there is a few steps to the Alexander technique. The very first one is called awareness. So a student of the Alexander technique learns to become aware when they're contracted. So I might be sitting talking to some people and kind of going, yeah, and then I realize I'm contracted. Awareness is the realization you're contracted. And then the second step in the Alexander technique after awareness is inhibition, critical piece. Inhibition means you inhibit doing anything about the contraction. Because if you immediately go to don't contract, you're going to uncontract the wrong way. So you begin with awareness. So I'm contracted. I'm here on the phone and I'm getting kind of an achy neck, and I suddenly go, oh my God, I'm contracted. And then inhibition, do nothing. Stay contracted. until you can go to the primary control, which is the one place that you can go to and actually facilitate a decompression of the spine. So I will go to my primary control. And what happens in me is that I release that one place where the top vertebrae meets the skull. I release that first. And then there's a movement all the way down my spine, releasing the vertebra. It's very subtle. And I did this over and over, and you do it with a teacher in this technique, getting up out of a chair, walking across the room. I began to do it playing piano. She had a piano in her studio. And eventually it becomes second nature, where contraction, you immediately go to the primary control. And what happens is when you release the small muscles first, the larger muscles respond. See, what happens is if you're just kind of contracted and you go, oh, let me straighten out, you're basically releasing the larger muscles. All the smaller muscles remain contracted, and you will return to a generally contracted state. But if you go to the primary control identified by Alexander and release that first, then everything follows. Now, in order to do this, you really need a teacher who can show you by placing their hands on the back of your head and on your chin, and can give you these oral instructions about releasing. It's very difficult to do, and from my experience, by trying to read about it, because having hands-on, they can give you the directions that you need to give yourself as you're moving about the room, in the space, in the studio where you're studying. But the fascinating thing was that once I did this long enough, then it could become something I would do while I was playing. Now, the injuries that I sustained, a lot of my research, I went to the medical library at UCLA to study the phenomenon of quote-unquote overuse syndrome. Not tendinitis, but overuse syndrome is a kind of contraction of the muscles. By playing with a lot of stress, the muscles are contracted and they create micro-lacerations in the muscle tissue. Those micro-lacerations heal themselves with scar tissue, but the scar tissue inhibits blood flow. So over time you are decreasing the amount of blood that can circulate through your arms. Well, oxygenation of the muscle is a requisite muscle movement and muscle action. And, the amount of oxygen required to play the piano is X amount, and the amount of oxygen that can get to the muscles when there's contraction and scar tissue eventually exceeds what the amount of blood that can get to the muscles and oxygenate the muscles is not enough for the activity. And then all of a sudden the muscles start to cramp and you're in pain and you can no longer play. So what Alexander technique taught me to do is, by releasing my spine and my shoulders and my arms, I increased the blood flow and compensated for all the scar tissue in my arms, and I was able to play again. And now I play without that tension and compression, and there's sufficient blood for my arms to be able to play. And that's the Alexander technique in a nutshell. The world is full of rich ideas that come from many, many corners, and they're not for everyone. But what I discovered about my own personal healing was I needed to be willing to investigate, explore, and listen, and be relentless and tenacious in order for myself to get enough messages, to get the signals and the information that I needed for my body to become well. It was a tremendous challenge, but my belief about healing is we must do the work, we must be relentless and dedicated to our healing, and we must listen. And it worked for me. And I'm able to play piano, and I've been doing it again for about 15 years. So that's Tribal Jazzman Scholar Story for today. Welcome, and thank you for joining me. That's all.